Hi, good morning, class. So today we are going to talk about the respiratory system. And the respiratory system is really responsible for the exchange of those essential gases, carbon dioxide exchanged for oxygen. So what is human respiration? The human respiratory system basically allows people to obtain oxygen from the air that they breathe in and eliminate carbon dioxide, which is basically a waste product of cellular respiration. If you have too much of carbon dioxide accumulate in your cells, it becomes toxic and can cause cell death. So you need to be able to have a system in place to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Breathing consists of two different phases. The first is inspiration. So this is basically the process of breathing in or taking air in. And expiration is the process of blowing air out or exhaling. So inspiration is also known as inhalation. Expiration is also known as exhalation. So breathing in and breathing out. So in one day, you will breathe more than 20,000 times. So this is basically a diagram of the human respiratory system, and this is exactly all the components of the respiratory system, including the nose, the mouth, and this epiglottis. So this is the also known as the nasal cavity. The air can get into your system through the nasal cavity and through the mouth. And basically it passes through the back of the mouth into the throat or the pharynx region, and the epiglottis covers the larynx. This is your larynx right over here. When you're eating, this becomes like a flap on top of your larynx, so that the food and the water doesn't go through the wrong tube. It should be the food and water goes down the esophagus, but this is known as the trachea or windpipe. It is not the esophagus. And this is basically the main airway. So inhaled air through your nose and your mouth will come through the pharynx, then the larynx, and through the trachea, which is your windpipe. And the trachea basically branch off to two different branches, which are known as the bronchi. And the bronchi are broken off, or they branch out even further into what are known as bronchioles. And these are basically this is lung tissue. This is your left lung. This is your right lung. This is the branching of the bronchi, which is basically a bronchiole. And at the end of all these bronchioles are little air sacs called alveoli. And it is at the air sacs that gas exchange takes place. So carbon dioxide is basically delivered to the lungs in through the alveoli from the blood, the circulatory system through the capillaries, and from the air that is in the blood in the capillaries, the oxygen basically diffuses into the alveoli. So the carbon dioxide will go out of the alveoli, whereas oxygen will go entering into the alveoli. Then you have what is known as the diaphragm. This is basically a muscle that allows for your lungs to expand and to contract. And then protecting your lungs is the rib cage. And in between these reddish regions here, these are muscles. They're called intercostal muscles, and they allow for the lungs to also expand and contract, because when these muscles expand and contract, the rib cage is either raised or lowered to inflate and deflate the lungs to get air in and air out. Okay, so this is known as the upper respiratory tract. Okay, and then anything below the larynx is known as the lower respiratory tract, including the lung, the intercostal muscle, rib cage, the diaphragm, and the pleural membranes, which basically it's a covering of that lung tissue. So from atmosphere to alveoli, so each time you inhale air begins a journey that starts at your nose or mouth and ends inside one of millions of tiny air pockets within your lungs called the alveoli. Okay, so you see on the left here, air is basically coming in, going into the lungs, and air is also being excreted back through the lungs into the bronchioles, and then back up the trachea to be exhaled. So the respiratory tract is often divided into two main areas. Remember, the upper and the lower respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract includes, again, the nose and the mouth, the nasal cavity, which is in basically the back of the nose, the pharynx, and the larynx, and the epiglottis, the trachea, and then the components of the upper respiratory tract. Basically, this is the nose, mouth, and the nasal cavity. The nose and mouth, basically the point of entrance, includes the point of entrance. The nasal cavity basically is where these are lined with cells that produce a sticky mucus. Nostrils contain stiff hairs, and the mucus and the hairs trap dust particles and other and bacteria and other harmful particles, so that they don't enter into your lungs. They trap the unwanted debris before it can enter into your lungs, so that you can, you have to clean your nose, you have to blow your nose. This stuff will trap it. Air is also moistened in the nasal cavity and warmed, so that it keeps the lungs, when the air goes in through to your lungs from the nasal cavity, it keeps the lungs from drying out. So here's a really nice diagram of these hairs, these stiff hairs that usually guys use those nose trimmers to get rid of, but they basically collect those nasties that you have to clean out every once in a while, and so that they don't enter into the nasal cavity and then go into your larynx and pharynx and finally your trachea. So the upper respiratory tract, the pharynx, the larynx, and trachea. So the pharynx is the passage for air and food, but the larynx is basically the structure between the pharynx and the trachea. Right over here, this is your epiglottis, and it contains the vocal cords of the voice box. Muscles attached to the vocal cords can tighten them. Cords move closer together. When air from the lungs force through, they vibrate to produce sound. This is what you can see on the right side right here. And the epiglottis, basically will cover the trachea, so that the food and the water don't come into the trachea and go in the wrong way. The trachea is that long kind of tube-like structure, and this is a scope diagram. So this is basically what it looks like inside. You can see that it's made up of rings of tough cartilage that kind of keep it open. Some cells in this lining contain hair-like structures called cilia, tiny little hairs, which basically beat in one direction. You can't really see them here, but they beat in one direction, and they also secrete mucus and trap those pollutants and other particles. And the cilia beat in the direction that moves the debris back up, so that it can either be coughed out or it can be swallowed. So this is, you can see the rings around the trachea that finally eventually lead to the right bronchus and the left bronchus, and then eventually the bronchioles. So these are the cilia that I'm talking about. These are the nasties, and you can see that they're being beaten. The hairs are beating and kind of pushing that debris upwards so that it can be either coughed or swallowed out. The lower respiratory tract includes the lungs, the bronchi, bronchioles, the alveoli. The components of the lower respiratory tract, the lungs, basically the lungs contain the bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. These are soft. They take up the lungs take up most of that chest cavity. Grooves separate the lungs into portions called lobes. There are, the right and the left lung are different in terms of the number of lobes that exist. So you can see over here, this is basically the right lungs. You got 1, 2, 3 lobes, and you got 1, 2 on the, you can't really tell, but yeah, these are the lobes. On the trachea, the bronchus, okay, and the bronchus will branch out into bronchioles, and then eventually at the top of those bronchioles are the alveoli. The bronchi, basically the trachea branches into 2 bronchi. Each bronchus branches, sorry, this is a typo, into smaller and narrower tubes called the bronchioles. And at the end of those bronchioles are what are called alveoli. So this is a bronchiole, and at the end is this kind of balloon-like structure. They're air-like structures, and they are surrounded by capillaries, which are 1 cell thick, so that gas exchange can take place easily. There are over 3 million of these that make up most of the lungs. Again, the wall of each alveoli is 1 cell thick and surrounded by a mesh of tiny capillaries. You can see these are blood vessels, tiny little capillaries that oxygen basically will enter from that capillary into the alveoli. Carbon dioxide will exit the alveoli and enter into the blood vessel, the capillary network. So how does the respiratory and circulatory systems work together? Well, we kind of know from the last lesson that blood that is deoxygenated when it's in the heart needs to go through a pulmonary circuit first. It needs to go to the lungs where it becomes oxygenated. The carbon dioxide basically is dropped off there. Oxygen is picked up. It goes back to the heart, and then from the heart, then it goes to the rest of the body. So it does this by the gas exchange process. So each alveoli is surrounded by, again, a mesh of capillaries, which are the tiniest, the thinnest blood vessels from the circulatory system. Air in the alveoli has a greater concentration of oxygen than the blood. Where will that oxygen go? So basically, you have over here, you have in the alveoli, the oxygen is inside the alveoli, oxygen is greater concentration than the capillaries. So when that blood, which is deoxygenated, comes and lines that alveoli, the oxygen from the alveoli will enter into this into the capillary network, and now this is red, and the red signifies the basically the fact that it's oxygenated now. This is deoxygenated blood, now it's oxygenated. Okay, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveoli to be expired, okay, or exhaled. It means the same thing. And this happens because of what we learned in class, the beginning of this semester, because of the fact that there is diffusion that takes place because of the change or the concentration gradients. When you go have something that is at high concentration, it will always move to low concentration when we are talking about passive diffusion. Breathing and muscles. So you couldn't take a breath without muscles. Again, you need the diaphragm muscle, which is underneath the lungs. It has a dome shape when relaxed. Okay, so like, let me show you. So when the lungs are relaxed, the diaphragm is more dome shaped. It expands when the lungs inflate. So flattened when contracted, and there's breathing in that's happening. The other muscles that are involved in breathing are the intercostal muscles, and these are the rib muscles. And when breathing in, they cause the rib cage to move upward and outward. So the movement of these muscles basically sucks air in and pushes air out. Oops. Okay, so this is how the breathing takes place with these different types of muscles. Sorry, I'm just gonna go back. Okay, so there's two different types of muscles. So the respiratory system basically is very connected to the circulatory system. It's connected to all the systems anyways, including the digestive system, but they go hand in hand. And the main parts of the respiratory system include breathing and gas exchange that takes place, so that when you're breathing, the oxygen is coming into your lungs, but from your lungs it needs to get into all the different parts of the body, and that only happens because of the gas exchange that takes place at the level of the capillaries, which is right over here. So now this oxygenated blood is going to go back to from the lungs to the heart, and then it will be pumped out from the main artery, which is the aorta, to all the different parts of the body, so that oxygen and other nutrients can be delivered. And again, it's a cyclical process. Anyways, if you have any questions about this PowerPoint, please let me know. I hope that you understood everything, but let me know if you need any further clarification. Have a wonderful day, class.